Kate, you know as well as I do that hundreds of thousands of people arriving next year or any year can place unsustainable burdens on communities. They can stimulate ugly far-right activity, and the British people have the right to expect that we have control over our borders and immigration is being kept at sustainable levels. Those are all reasonable things to say. It's also right, and you'll have heard this in the autumn statement, that we are, doing everything we can to encourage people back into work. There are more than 2.5 million people on incapacity benefits. A lot of the focus is getting them into some form of work so that the numerous vacancies we have in our labour market are not being filled from overseas, but are being filled domestically. And I think many people would agree with that.
Do you think we need to cut net migration to reduce that risk of the far right? You've linked those two things together. Do you think we need to cut it to reduce that risk?
I think we need to have net migration at a level that is sustainable and commands public consent. And I think that where there are British workers who could fill British vacancies in health and care sectors, for example, but just because there's a shortage there, I think it is really important that we're doing everything we can to marry up those two groups. And I think people would expect us to. And I think where there are shortages and people have to be brought in, it is right we look at other factors, for example, the number of dependents, so that people feel that this is a controlled system and that the government has control of people coming in. We're doing all of that. And by the way, the ONS does expect numbers to start falling, seriously falling in the months and years ahead.
But the reality is that in the short term, if the government is successful in reducing migration, you're going to do economic damage, aren't you? You're going to do economic damage to universities, which are underfunded. And as Kate was saying, you're going to cause problems with people getting the healthcare which they need.
I don't think that that's true, and I don't think the evidence sustains that conclusion, Adam, with respect.
Why?
Because we've already taken steps to look at, for example, dependence in the relation of students, and we're still seeing high numbers of students arriving in the UK to study at our universities. So I think we can't draw those conclusions.
I mean, you've already used the word deterrent about Rwanda. If you deter people from coming, if you're successful, fewer people will come, and that will have an economic impact.
So I have said it should be looked as much more of an ecosystem. Measures that were announced in the autumn statement were, directed specifically at getting a number of people who could work but aren't working back into the labour market, filling some of those vacancies. Now, that won't have an economic detrimental impact. At the same time, we'll need to look carefully at the health and social care sectors, at what the need is for labour, but also are some of those questions that people would expect. Should every care worker have, what should be the limitations on the number of dependents that they can bring in? And I think that those are fair questions. And I think that the British public would expect a responsible government to be asking them and to be scrutinising those points.
If you look at the record of this Conservative government since 2010, as a result of Brexit, what has happened with migration is numbers have not gone down. More people have come in from Africa and South Asia, and fewer people have come in for Europe. Is that a beneficial outcome?
It's true that we have seen an increase in non-EU migration, but I think that the real focus of the government now is to bring overall levels. It's not about one country over another.
You say that, but you haven't done it.
Well, we have. We've started to look at the students and the dependents that they can bring in. There's going to be something this week. And you also know that the ONS is already forecasting that the measures that we started to put in place are going to bring numbers down significantly. So yes, look, I accept the numbers that were announced last week are too high, but the government is looking at the levers at its disposal. It's analysed the data, who's coming in for what purpose. Students and health and care workers are one category. They've asked what more could we do with our domestic workforce, and I've answered that. And they're looking at overall numbers, particularly this year, things like dependence and salary levels, to see what they can do to bring it down to a sustainable level.
Just finally on immigration, what is a good number? What's a sustainable number that would have the consent of the British public in terms of net migration?
There isn't a sort of set number that you're going to get me to commit to, because I think that the ebb and flow of both the labour market and the levels that are sort of right for certain sectors, is a shifting picture. But we are clear, it needs to come down significantly from where it is. It's on track to do that, but we definitely need new measures to ensure that that happens rapidly.
So was it wrong to have a previous number then? In previous Conservative manifestos, you have had a number. Was that the wrong idea?
Well, I think it proved quite challenging to achieve that number. I would accept that. And I think it's much better to look at it in a sort of in terms of proportions, and also to look at where really there is immigration that really shouldn't be happening.
Okay. I want to turn to your own brief, because there was a story this week that really, it shocked me. I'm sure it will have shocked other people who read it. Gareth Wynne Jones, who stalked his ex-girlfriend, held her at gunpoint. Now, he's going to be automatically released from prison next year. Despite the fact that the parole board warned he's not actually safe to live in the community. How can that be right?
Well, first of all, sentencing is a matter for the court. It's separate to anything that the government does. I read the details of this case, and I was pretty shocked by actually the facts of the offence. He was sentenced to an extended determinate sentence, I think in around 2015, which means under the terms of what the judge saw fit, 50% of his sentence is in custody and 50% is on licence. Now, I take the point that I think you're making, Kate, but I just would point out one thing to you. Being released on licence nowadays does not mean what it used to, say, 10, 20 years ago, when there might be a tag, sort of radio frequency tag, that could just about tell you whether the person was still in their property or whether they'd left. We now have very sophisticated monitoring equipment, for example, GPS tagging, that can tell you exactly where a person is. And there will be, by the way, conditions attached to his licence about where he's able to go, who he's able to reach, who he's able to communicate with, where, no-go zones. And GPS tagging is highly effective. I go on to say there are things like home detention curfew. And by the way, when somebody like him is released on licence, he has the sword of Damocles hanging over his head, 1 foot out of line with the case, particularly given what the parole board have said, and he can expect to be recalled to prison. So this is a case, an ugly case, an ugly offence, but you would expect him to be extremely carefully monitored. And the sophistication of our current monitoring and licensing arrangements is completely different to where it used to be, even in quite recent memory.
Yeah, you see, I think there's some people, particularly, his victim, Rhiannon Bragg, might have a problem feeling confident in that, because she had previously reported him to police. His guns had been removed from him. They were then handed back to him, and he later committed this offence. The police were aware of him. They were aware of his behaviour, and they eventually admitted that if they had charged him sooner, which they could have done, she would never have had to go through this. So what would you say to Rhiannon Bragg? How can she trust what you're saying? Can you give her a guarantee that she will be safe, like all women will be safe around a man like him?
Well, look, this was a really ugly case. But the truth of the matter is that even if he was to serve more time in prison, somebody like that could always be a risk to women. And I will just say this: whatever the deficiencies in the policing process that led up to her ordeal when he was, when he kind of held her hostage overnight, he is not going to be in any position where he is allowed to have a gun in his possession or to have any offensive weapon. He is going to be monitored and observed and tracked to the highest possible degree. Yes, he's out on licence, but he is not in some sort of environment where he can kind of slip under the radar or re-establish contact or rearm himself or take any of those measures. And if he puts 1 foot out of line, he can expect recall to prison.
Are women and girls as safe as they should be in the UK right now, do you think?
I think one of the things that I've learned actually in my 4 years in Parliament is that you can pass all the laws in the world, but unless you have a fundamental shift in attitudes, and you have consistency in policing, and you have buy-in actually at every level of society, including really in the way that I hate the sort of making it sound glib, but educate children and allow mindsets to develop. And I think you've always got a challenge, and I think it'll always be a work in progress.